This House believes in a world government. The model of the nation-state has traditionally provided the basis for international relations. However, there are many problems which are impossible for individual nation-states to solve and which require international cooperation. For example, environmental problems, third world poverty, international law, trading rules, etc. And cosmopolitanism is coming back into fashion. Many people consider there to be such a thing as an international society with international laws. This has serious implications for the old nation-state model and evokes the possibility of the United Nations evolving into a popularly elected world government. Should and could such a government exist? World government refers to the idea of all humankind united under one common political authority. Arguably, it has not existed so far in human history. Yet proposals for a unified global political authority have existed since ancient times, in the ambitions of kings, popes, and emperors, and the dreams of poets and philosophers. Note: there are many possible models that can be proposed when debating motions on world government. Each model yields a slightly different debate. Here is one option. The proposed world government would represent a qualitative advance over the United Nations of today. It would comprise legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Its high officials would be elected by its constituent population, and it would possess its own military force and powers of taxation. It would be federal in form, so that the identity and institutions of its member nations would be fully preserved and protected. The voting system in the world legislature would embody a balanced separation of powers so that neither the populous poorer nations of the world nor the less populous richer nations could impose their preferences on the other. Membership in the World Federation would not be obligatory on all nations, and moreover, member nations could freely depart from the World Federation at any time at their own unilateral discretion. Member nations could also retain control over whatever independent armed forces they feel essential to their national interests. The expectation is that after a sufficiently lengthy period of gradual evolution, these retained rights of the member nations would become unimportant in a practical sense. As this happens, the world government would gradually become more authoritative and effective while remaining democratic and benign. Okay, so let's look at some points against and counterpoints. Okay, point. There is too much economic, political, and cultural heterogeneity in the contemporary world to permit the establishment of a democratically organized, authoritative and effective, yet benign, world government. This was especially the case during the Cold War era, with its virulent opposition between communist and non-communist economic, political and social ideologies. But it is still the case. For example, if a democratic world government were established, it would likely want to create a global welfare state, but this would be unacceptable to citizens of the rich countries because of the excessive taxation necessary to provide welfare benefits to the citizens of the poor nations. Another possibility is that the world government would be effectively controlled by the rich nations, despite appearances of democracy, and thus it would implement policies of uncontrolled trade and investment. These would be unacceptable to the poor nations because they would be regarded as a return to the exploitative conditions of the colonial era. Thus, a serious effort to establish a world government in the real world would almost certainly lead to widespread armed resistance, and this might well escalate into the very nuclear world war that the world government was supposed to prevent. That would be the ultimate irony. Counterpoint. Although post-World War II world government proposals were mostly for an unlimited world government, descriptively designated the omnipotent world state, there has been considerable evolution in world federalist thought since the immediate post-war period. More recent proposals envision a limited federal world government subject to significant restraints that would effectively eliminate the danger of global tyranny. Among these are proposals that discontented member nations may withdraw peacefully, at their unilateral discretion, from the Federation, and that member nations are allowed to retain independent control over armed forces. In addition to these provisions, a sensible voting scheme in the world legislature would preclude the poor countries enforcing their preferences on the rich countries, and vice versa. In any case, excessive emphasis on the heterogeneity of nations tends to obscure the fact that, in reality, despite the obvious differences in language, race, religion and culture, a considerable amount of consensus has already been achieved among the global human population on some critical elements of ethical behavior and social organization. The existence of a federal world government would facilitate further development of the friendly, cooperative, and mutually supportive impulses within people. Okay, Counterpoint. From the early 1990s, at about the time of the collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union, there has developed an immense literature on global governance in the post-Cold War era. It is agreed by many, if not most, international relations authorities that the existing institutions of global governance, comprising the United Nations and several others, are achieving as much as can reasonably be expected given the extreme diversity of the contemporary global human population, its widely differing perceptions, viewpoints, and policy preferences. If this diversity is hampering efforts to improve the global human prospect, this is unfortunate, but there is no reason to expect that a formal world government would not be similarly hampered. Furthermore, significant improvements can be made, such as the proposed Global Parliamentary Assembly, GPA, that would convert or replace the UN General Assembly with a directly elected assembly, without going to the premature extreme of full-fledged world government. Many other ideas short of world government were offered by the Commission on Global Governance of the early 1990s. Many of these are viable and attractive options for making progress without an excessively risky departure from the status quo. Thus, there is no need to make a reckless giant step into world government when there are more cautious baby steps that could be taken toward improving international harmony and cooperation. Counterpoint. There is no doubt that the processes of global governance have improved since the decline of the Cold War in the early 1990s as a result of the collapse and dissolution of the Soviet Union. But it is unduly naive to suggest, as do some global governance enthusiasts, that the United Nations and other international institutions amount to a virtual global government that is as effective as an actual world government would be. Close examination of actual events at the international level shows that national interests tend to trump global interests again and again. As for baby step proposals, such as the Global Parliamentary Assembly, these are uninspired and uninspiring. So long as the UN General Assembly, or its equivalent, remains a purely consultative body confined to issuing resolutions with no power of enforcement, then it makes very little difference whether its members are elected by the national populations or appointed by the national governments. A fully fledged world government, as an institutional reality with legislative, executive, and judicial branches, the high officials of which would be directly elected by the global constituency, would constitute a quantum leap forward that would excite the human imagination. So long as it is properly limited according to the more recent post-Cold War World Federalist proposals, it would not constitute a meaningful threat to the legitimate national interests of the member nations. Okay, point. A world government would add another layer of bureaucracy to a world which is already labouring under a heavy burden of bureaucracy. Were a world government bureaucracy to be added to what already exists at the national, regional and local levels, it would be accurate to describe the situation as bureaucratic suffocation or bureaucratic strangulation. Of their nature, bureaucracies stifle creative thought and innovation. A world government would be subject to so many conflicting viewpoints and attitudes that its bureaucracy would necessarily have to impose an overwhelming deluge of requirements, restrictions, forms and reports on the citizens. The citizens would be effectively hamstrung and be, figuratively speaking, more or less trussed up in straitjackets. So even if, by some remote chance, the world state did not immediately denigrate into a brutal police state, its massive bureaucracy would in some ways constitute a virtual police state. The problem of bureaucracy alone argues against a world state. Counterpoint. Although it is a popular form of entertainment to malign generic bureaucracies, professional sociologists define a bureaucracy in neutral terms as any large-scale hierarchical organization that practices specialization and division of labor in its operations. According to this definition, such organizations as armies, navies, business corporations, the International Red Cross, and numerous others are classified as bureaucracies, no less than national tax collection agencies, the archetypal target of bureaucracy haters. It is important to understand that bureaucracies do not arise from nowhere, but are a tangible consequence of perceived needs and shared purposes. With that in mind, it can further be argued that a world government would not necessarily increase the total bureaucratic burden on the human population of the world. Some functions currently handled by separate national government bureaucracies might more cost-effectively be handled by an analogous world government bureaucracy. Okay, point. Some eminent international relations authorities have argued that no feasible transition path of a benign nature exists from the present situation of national sovereignty to a world government. A nuclear world war might change this situation. Such a war might so shock and horrify the global human population that it will turn to world government in desperation. This outcome is possible, of course, but it is equally possible that after a nuclear Armageddon had occurred, the scattered and demoralized survivors would be neither capable of nor interested in world government. Quite likely, the surface of the world would become subdivided into a host of autonomous principalities presided over by dictatorial warlords. It would seem that in a post-nuclear war world, there would be just as much chance of severe political fragmentation taking place as there is of further political consolidation. And the counterpoint: the fact that some international relations authorities do not have the imagination required to perceive a feasible transition path to world government is not necessarily strong evidence that such a path does not exist. The principal reason why the idea of world government is not being pursued vigorously at the present time is that it is assumed by the large majority that world government could only be realized in the form of the omnipotent world state. But if a sufficient amount, a critical mass, so to speak, of awareness of the limited world government option is achieved, the situation could change dramatically within a short period of time. If there was sufficiently widespread and strong support for world government, it could be established by the same sort of international conference that established the United Nations. As for world government coming about through nuclear world war, no sane and sensible world federalist gives this any credence. So yeah, some good points and counterpoints going back and forth here on this website. So go check the site out. It's idebate.org, it's called. Good little site. Anyway, all the best, folks, and I will catch you later. Peace.